Hey, everybody. Good evening. It's Ellen Lewis from Crazy for You with the Crazy for You podcast. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. We are going to talk this evening about choosing yarn and substituting yarn. When I sent out the survey and questionnaire for the membership site a week or so ago, that was one of the topics that people said that they really struggled with and that they really wanted a little guidance on. And it can be pretty confusing. So I thought tonight we would talk a little bit about yarn weights and gauge and choosing yarns and substituting yarns for a pattern. So stay with me. I think it's going to be really fun. If you are not already a subscriber and you have the opportunity, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And that way you will be notified. Click the little bell. You'll be notified every time that I go live or upload a video, which I don't do very often. I go live every week on Wednesdays at 7 o'clock Eastern time, but I don't upload very many videos. I guess I just really like the interaction of live. I like having you here. Like, hey Gwen, I love to see you and I love to interact with you. But if you are watching later on and there are comments or whatever, go ahead and enter if you want. That's totally fine. Hey Mindy, nice to see you. So let me get this cleared up. I have had a great evening. I was back at Spice tonight. And for those of you who are local to Leonardtown, you know that Spice is a wonderful bar studio right next door to my shop, conveniently. And it has the most amazing community of women who go. And I haven't been exercising for forever. It seems it's just been awful. And you don't realize how much you miss a thing until you do it again, until you get back at it. But it felt really good. And I was talking to my daughter and she said, we always tell ourselves we don't have time. But the truth is that we just don't always make it a priority for ourselves. We don't always make self-care a priority. So, I don't know. I just thought I'd share that with you, that it was really good. And, whatever your exercise is, whether it's just stretching or, walking around the block or whatever, I think it's really important to kind of take that time for self-care, even when you are really busy. And the same with knitting, taking that time to take time for yourself, to make it a priority. Hey, Gail, nice to see you. So I guess we should start talking about yarn. So like I said, yarn gauge and things like that, and choosing yarn and substituting yarn or even selecting yarn for a pattern, I think it can be very confusing. So tell me in the comments if that's something that you ever struggle with, if you find it confusing in any way, or if it's a struggle for you, or you're just learning about it. I'm interested. And while you're there, tell me if you have a specific question about choosing yarn or substituting yarn, and I will try to answer that for you tonight, because I get that it is confusing. And we'll talk about why it's confusing. So, hey, Terry, nice to see you. Okay, so let's talk about why yarn and yarn selection is so confusing. So to do that, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to bring up something that is called the Craft Yarn Council Yarn Standard. So let me do that here. Hang on. Okay. So this is what is referred to as the Craft Yarn Council categories of yarn. And I don't know how well you can see that on your screen, but so let's just start in. All right. So you've got these 7 categories from 0 to 7, obviously, and they're called lace, superfine, fine, light, medium, bulky, super bulky, and jumbo. All right. So those are the buckets. Hi, Norma. I'm glad you like this topic. So go ahead and tell me if there's anything in particular that you're interested in hearing. So those are the names that they've given the 0 through 7 categories of yarn. And then they have these these names, like these common names of yarn. So under 0, which they say lace, they have fingering, 10 count, and crochet thread. And then under number 1, superfine, they have sock, fingering, baby. Wait a minute. Okay, fingering is in superfine? I thought fingering was in lace. Okay, whatever. So then we go over to 2, fine, sport, baby. Wait, I thought baby was 1, right? Baby? Is baby 1 or is baby 2? If it says baby yarn, which is it that I'm looking for? Okay, whatever. And then we're looking at number 3, light, DK, light, worsted. Number 4, worsted, Afghan, Aran. Okay, worsted, which is worsted. We hear worsted a lot. That's a term that we see a lot, right? And then over here, we've got chunky, craft, and rug, and then a bulky, roving. Bulky is here under super bulky, but bulky I thought was number 5. So it's no wonder that it makes your head absolutely spin to look at this, right? Tell me in the comments if this is clear to anybody. So, hey, Evelyn, nice to see you. So it's actually not very helpful at all. It's right up there in terms of helpfulness with the vanity sizing that we see at so many clothing stores. You know, hi, I wear a medium. Okay, right. What does that mean anyway? Or when you look at the sizing and it says small, only there's extra small and extra, extra small and extra, extra, extra small below you. And then you realize, oh, small is actually medium or large. They're just trying to make me feel good. So yeah, there's none of that going on here. It's just that they had to set up these buckets because they have to have a place to put every kind of yarn. Every yarn has to have a home, right? So what is important and what does actually matter is this knit gauge range. So the terms that when you're in the yarn store, what we typically refer to is we usually call this this 0 lace or sometimes cobweb. If you're getting up in the 40 stitches to 4 inches or, you know, higher, you know, that very fine. We often refer to that as cobweb or lace. This super fine with a gauge of 27 to 32 is usually what we call fingering. And I'm not even going to get on the topic of sock because not all fingering weight yarn is sock yarn. Sock yarn is a very specific kind of yarn that is good for socks. All right. It has a higher twist, usually has some component of nylon or polyamide or polyester or silk to give it strength. And it's usually maybe a little more tightly spun. It's certainly a strong yarn, but we're not talking about that today. That would be a whole nother episode. Hey, Shelly, nice to see you. So we have lace, fingering, sport, DK, worsted, chunky, bulky, or super bulky, and roving. And typically we don't even carry jumbo as a yarn. If the yarn store carries roving, that's where it's going to be. But that's not something that we typically knit with, right? But these gauge things are important. So if you go into a yarn store armed with, I have a pattern and it says I need a number 4 yarn. All right. So you go into the yarn store and you say to the nice, helpful yarn store lady, I need a yarn that is a number 4. So that means you're looking for something that knits at somewhere between 16 and 20. Actually, let's back up. Let's say you have a pattern that calls for 20 stitches over 4 inches, which is much more likely a place that you would start. Okay, so you have a pattern, it calls for a gauge of 20 stitches over 4 inches. So you go to this chart and you see that 20 stitches to 4 inches is a number 4. So you take that information and you go to the yarn store and you say, I'm looking for a number 4. So you start looking for yarns that have a gauge of 16 to 20. Now, you might end up with a yarn that knits at 16 stitches over 4 inches. And I'm going to tell you, a yarn that knits at 16 stitches over 4 inches is a substantially different yarn than one that knits or is happy at 20 stitches to 4 inches. And you might also completely ignore this beautiful DK weight yarn that knits at 21 because it's not in the bucket where you're looking for it, you know? So it's a good idea to kind of get outside of this whole range of 1, 2, 3, 4. Honestly, I'm going to say something that might make me very unpopular, but it's the fact. Most yarn stores don't even think about these numbers because not because they're wrong or we're trying to be obtuse or we're trying to be elitist. It's just that they're not adequately precise for our knitting needs. Does that make sense? So it's just too big a range. 16 to 20 is really too large a range for a yarn to make sense in a garment. I hope that makes sense. Tell me in the comments if you're with me, if that makes sense so far. So how does this kind of play out in terms of you have a pattern and you're looking for a yarn? So let me look at let me bring up on Ravelry some patterns and we'll kind of talk through it. Okay, so here is a beautiful pattern. This is The Weekender by Andrea Mowry, and a lot of people have made this. It's a really, really pretty pattern. So she is looking for, in this, a yarn that's 18 stitches over 4 inches. Now, remember that your pattern is going to give you a whole lot of really, really good information. Okay, so let's talk about what that good information is. One, they're going to tell you, first and foremost, what gauge they want this garment to be knit at. Okay, and that's a requirement for Ravelry. You know, you can't upload a pattern to Ravelry without indicating the gauge. Okay, so the gauge that they're looking for in this pattern is 18 stitches over 4 inches. Now we know from our little chart that worsted is a range that knits like 16 to 20. So we kind of know generally where we're looking. All right. And the other thing that they're going to tell you that is useful is what yarn they used. And sometimes, now they didn't here, but sometimes they'll tell you other yarns that they recommend. So you can sort of get a sense of it. So with this information of 18 stitches, you can go to the yarn store and you can say with confidence, I'm looking for a yarn that knits at 18 stitches to 4 inches. Okay. Does that mean that you can't use any other yarn? No, you know, so when they say that they're looking in that pattern, when the designer says the gauge of this project is 18 stitches over 4 inches, what that means is that's how the pattern is written. The pattern is written so that if you cast on the number of stitches for the size that you've selected and you're knitting at a gauge of 18 stitches over 4 inches, the pattern and the garment are going to come out to the size that's indicated in the pattern. All right. It doesn't mean that you must find a yarn that knits exclusively at 18 stitches to 4 inches because yarns also have a range. Right? So I have another camera here and I'm going to see if I can't bring this up and show you. I have all of these yarns here. So you know that you're going to make the Weekender and you've got a gauge of 18 stitches to 4 inches. So you walk over and you're like, wow, I really like this yarn. This yarn is really pretty. It has an interesting texture. Let's see. So the ball band of the yarn is going to give you a huge amount of information. So let's look at this. It says 19. So when you look at a ball band, you're going to look for this little square here. Do you see this square? This is the square that tells you what the manufacturer thinks is a really great gauge for this yarn. That means that if you want a fabric that feels nice for a sweater, it's not too tight, it's not too stiff, it's not too loose, it's the baby bear gauge for this yarn, it's going to be 19 on this yarn. 19 stitches and 26 rows over 4 inches. And somebody is blowing up my phone, and I'm just going to turn them off because, sorry. Okay, so this doesn't say 18, does it? It says 19. Is that okay? Can you use that? Yeah, absolutely you can. So when you're looking at substituting yarns, you have a bit of flexibility, okay? So that's one point. Now, we have a really great question here. Will changing your needle size make a difference? Okay, so let's talk about that. So the patterns give you good information. Like I said, they give you the gauge, they give you the suggested yarn or the yarn that they used. And they also give you some information that is absolutely not useful at all. Okay? They tell you what size needle they used. What size needle they used is the size they used, the designer used. Okay? The designer used that size needle to get that gauge with that yarn. Okay? The size needle that you use or that you need to get that gauge is completely irrelevant. Okay? What's important is that you're getting the gauge that the pattern needs for you to get. Okay? Does that make sense? If you're a tight knitter and you use the exact same yarn recommended in the pattern and the exact size needle that they recommend in the pattern, but you knit more tightly than the designer, your gauge isn't going to come out right. It's going to be tighter. You would need a larger needle. So your gauge might come out to 22 stitches to 4 inches because you knit really tightly and each of your stitches is smaller. And so you have more stitches that fit into an inch. So you're going to get a different gauge. You would have to go up to a larger needle to get the gauge recommended in the pattern with whatever yarn you're using. Even if you're using the exact same yarn that the designer recommends, your gauge is almost as personal as your fingerprint. Okay, we all know if we're, kind of an average gauge knitter or a tight knitter or a loose knitter, and different yarns require different needles. Okay, so a stretchier yarn is going to need a larger needle than a plant-based yarn that doesn't have as much elasticity. You're going to want to knit that on a tighter needle, but that's a topic for a whole another podcast. But do you see what I'm saying? That this yarn knits at 19 stitches over 4 inches, and they're recommending that on a 5 millimeter needle, which is an 8. So yeah, you could definitely use this, and you simply would have to put it on your needles and swatch it and see what size needle you need to use to get the gauge that this pattern is calling for. All right, so let's look at another one. We've got another one over here. This happens to be Alegria Grande, and let's see what its gauge says. It says 18 to 20 stitches over 4 inches. You see that? So it gives a range. That's kind of nice, isn't it? So whether you were using a pattern, so obviously this is going to work just fine, right? It says 18 stitches. Perfect. Perfect. Here's another one. This is Kid Classic. Where is its gauge information? Hello, friend. Okay. You see that? 18 to 19 stitches over 4 inches. Right? Okay. So here's a question. You could also double strand the strands of lighter yarn to reach gauge of a 1 strand of heavier yarn. Right. Yes, you absolutely can. And we did a whole series of that some years ago, and we did like a whole little chart. I'll see if I can't dig that out. But 2 strands of worsted weight, or, yarn that knits at about 20 stitches over 4 inches held together, will give you a yarn that knits at about 12 stitches over 4 inches. We recently did a project using 2 strands of this beautiful Rowan alpaca classic. 2 strands of this together worked beautifully on a 10.5 at a gauge of 14 stitches over 4 inches. That is a lot less precise, and that's exactly what it's one of those instances when you really have to you do have to swatch it. But yeah, knowing kind of the range. So 18 stitches over 4 inches is a nice sort of medium worsted gauge. So I sort of think of worsted as 18 to 20. Now, if you wanted to use this beautiful yarn by Kim Dye's Yarn, this is a gorgeous yarn. And its gauge, it says on the ball band, it doesn't say on the ball band what the gauge is, but I happen to know that it would also be lovely at 18. It's going to make a slightly looser fabric. And so you get to decide, you're the creator, and you get to decide what fabric that you like for your garment, right? So I think it's always okay to go a little bit outside. Like if you fall in love with a yarn that says it knits at 21, then you can absolutely buy a skein of it, and swatch it up and see, right? Because it's probably going to work just fine. I probably wouldn't put, a fingering weight yarn there, because it's not going to come out the way that the designer intended. You absolutely can do it, but you want something that is going to be close to what the designer intended. Let's look real quick at another pattern that I think makes it a little more challenging. So this is called Cadence, and let's see. Okay, this is Cadence, and this is by Jordana Page. This is a very pretty sweater knit in the round, has a pretty little lace motif, and this was on Ravelry some years back. And it's knit in a yarn called Silky Flamme that has been discontinued. So that's definitely where you're going to have to find something else. Okay, I have a question here. Is the vertical gauge important only in Raglan patterns or always? Okay, so your vertical gauge is important, especially as you mentioned in Raglans. It really depends on the sleeve cap shaping. So if you're doing a set-in sleeve and you have a very shallow sleeve cap over which you need to make a certain number of decreases, then you would want to get close to your row gauge, because if you run out of rows before you've made all of your shaping, then your sleeve cap might not fit into the armhole that you've established. So it's something to look at, but generally with an average set-in sleeve, you have enough space where the pattern will say work even until sleeve cap measures 5 inches, and then you begin your top cap shaping. So there is a little bit of play in there. That's a really good question, Evelyn. Did everybody see Evelyn's question here? Yeah. If you had to choose which gauge to focus on, definitely focus on the stitch gauge versus the row gauge, because you can always sort of adjust that, knit even until however many inches or centimeters are met. So, okay, so Cadence. This sweater is knit in my least favorite term. It's called Aran, which, if you notice, remember from our Yarn Council thing over here, Aran falls right in there with worsted. And this is a lot of gauge options between 16 and 20. So you'll notice that 15, which is just barely over the edge, is bulky. So that makes it a lot more challenging. But you would want to be looking for a yarn that knits kind of in the light, bulky, very heavy worsted. So you go to the store and you look at something like this DK. It's probably going to be too loose, but you could knit it with this one that we had. Let's see. Let me bring this up again. I'll add this. Okay, so this is a really pretty yarn. This is Merino Aria, and this says 14 stitches. Can you see that? 14 stitches and 21 rows. So you could probably do this. That's a couple inches away from the 16 that they recommend, or you could use, I think this one might be just a smidge loose, the 18, but you could try it. And it's interesting if you look at the yarn that they used, Silky Flamme, it's kind of a thick and thin. Let me share this again. It's a thick and thin yarn. Can you see that? It's been discontinued. We had it in the shop. It was a very pretty yarn, but again, kind of an awkward gauge. So thick and thin yarns like that. So you have thin places that bump up next to thick places, and you have thin places that bump up next to thin places, and you have thick places that bump up next to, whoops, that's not what I want. Thick places that bump up next to thick places. And so those thick places that bump up next to thick places give the yarn a thicker feel. So if you look at what other people have done, you can get a sense of how you feel about going with a heavier yarn. So there are yarns out there that knit at 16 stitches over 4 inches. I didn't happen to bring any today, but there are plenty. So if you're on Ravelry and you want to see maybe what yarn you're thinking about, you can go up here to yarn ideas, or you can look at the projects and you can see the yarn ideas, and they will show you all the different yarns that have been used. So a lot of people used Malabrigo worsted, which is a yarn that you're probably familiar with, which is just a heavy worsted. Its native gauge is, I believe, we had it in the shop. It's a lot like Manos Maxima. I believe its native gauge is 18, but let's have a look. Oh, that's not what I meant. Yeah, so Malabrigo worsted has a native gauge of 18, and a lot of people used it for this project. So you see where it says used 9 times. You can look at how it came out with that yarn and see if you like it, right? So that's a yarn that is slightly lighter than the 16 stitches over 4 inches that are recommended. I like it. I think that looks great. On the other hand, you might want to look at some of the projects that were knit in a much heavier yarn. For instance, some people used Vintage Chunky, all right, which is a yarn that knits at like 13. So you can see here, it's a very pretty, she's done a nice job here. But for me, I might find that just a smidge too stiff for this particular project. So there aren't a ton of yarns out there that knit at 16 stitches over 4 inches. It's just not a real popular gauge. You know, you tend to get things in the 14, 15, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 17, 18, you know, and above. So it is tough. But honestly, for this particular project, given what I have seen with the different projects, I would probably go with a yarn that was slightly lighter versus slightly heavier. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So when something says it needs a gauge of 16, you can use a yarn that is comfortable or ideally comfortable at a gauge of 17 or 18, and knowing that if you're knitting it at a gauge of 16, it's just going to be a smidge more open. Whereas if you're using a yarn that has a native gauge of 13, 14, 15 or below, it's going to be a little stiff. So the decision you have to make when you're choosing or substituting yarn, and you can't find a yarn that knits exactly in that sweet spot, you have to ask yourself, do I want this garment to have a little more structure, to be a little more stiff? Do I want to use a slightly heavier yarn at a tighter gauge? Or do I want it to be a little drapier? Do I want it to have a little less structure and feel a little more relaxed in the wearing? In which case you would want to go with a yarn that had, more stitches per inch. Please tell me if that makes sense. I say this stuff, all the time, and I just want to make sure that, especially those of you who are not really that comfortable with the whole gauge thing and making these decisions, if any part of what I'm saying is not making sense, please let me know, and I will go over it in a different way. I won't say the same thing again. I'll just go over it in a different way. But again, your garment, your yarn, your project, your decision. But choosing a yarn based on the pattern, the recommended gauge of the pattern, and then going and looking at the yarns at the ball band, because the ball band is going to give you the information you need. And the most important information is what size, what gauge the pattern is knit at, and what matching that with what the gauge on the ball band says. The ball band is going to tell you where the yarn is happiest, okay? And the pattern gauge is going to tell you the gauge that you need to knit to get the size that you want. So matching those two up, it's just a matter of looking at that gauge on the pattern and then going and finding the yarn that's within 1 or 2 stitches of that gauge. And always enlist the help of your friendly neighborhood yarn store owner or team member, because they know this stuff, right? And chances are that every yarn in the store has been swatched by one of the team members, and we can show you, okay, you're worried about, you're considering using this yarn at this gauge. Well, we happen to have a swatch of this yarn at this gauge, and then you can see and make the best decision. So I hope that helps. And again, if you have any questions after we're off, go ahead and put them in the comments. I will answer them in the comments. And again, if you want to contact me or whatever, you have a specific question about substituting yarn in a particular project, or you want a recommendation for a yarn for a particular project, please hit me up. I will be happy to help. And I love talking about yarn, and I could talk about yarn and knitting all day long, but I won't, because our time is up, and it's been a pleasure to be with you tonight. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that you are knitting something wonderful tonight, and I can't wait to see what it is. See you next week.